Okay, I think we're recording. So welcome everybody to this roundtable conversation. So this is part of the suite of recordings that we've put together for the SGSAH Supervisors training. And I thought, in addition to the PowerPoints that we've created for you about SGSAH and how it operates, it might be really great to get together a group of our SGSAH PhD researchers at various different stages of their PhD and various different topics in universities as well, to talk a bit about the experience of being supervised. I'm really aware as a supervisor that some of my, much of my experience, positive and negative, of supervision comes from my own experience a couple of decades ago, and it's quite hard to see into other supervision. So I thought it might be really nice to get some, I think largely very positive experiences, the four researchers who are going to tell you about today, but also think of what might be some examples of good practice. I had a funny experience myself with a SGSAH blogger who's just stopped being the SGSAH blogger. She wrote a blog about getting feedback from your supervisor. So she was one of my supervisees, and I opened up the blog and thought, oh no, what am I going to learn? And I did learn a lot actually about that process of receiving feedback from your supervisor and the best ways of dealing with that, but also delivering it as well. So that might be something we come on to in a moment. So hopefully this session will be interesting and give you some ideas of additional things that you might bring to your own supervisory teams. So I'm going to ask everybody to just briefly introduce themselves, say whereabouts they are in their PhD, maybe whereabouts they are physically as well, and yeah, what your PhD topic is too. So maybe Kirsty, can I go to you first of all?
Yeah, so I'm Kirsty. I'm currently in Aberdeen, and I'm in the final year of my PhD working on women as colonial collectors in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Grand, thank you. Belinda?
Hi, I'm Belinda. I'm currently coming to the end of the first year of my PhD. I'm exploring the experience of children as audience members to live theatre and dance performances.
Great, thank you. Stavroula?
Hi, I'm Stavroula. I have just defended my thesis like a month ago, and I was and I'm still a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, and I was working on Greek tragedy, and I was looking at the positive representations of erotic love.
Fantastic, thank you, and congratulations. And Maya?
Yes, I'm Maya. I finished my PhD in March this year, 2020. I had my Viva in March over Zoom, and I did my PhD in gender studies. More specifically, I looked at rape culture in internet memes about Me Too.
Great, and congratulations to you too as well, Maya. And I'm sure we'll come on to talking about Vivas and maybe Vivas over Zoom and remote supervision as well later on. So thank you very much, everybody. I wanted just to do a little further round of introductions, perhaps, because I know some of you have kind of, or had, in the case of Stavroula or Maya, kind of slightly different supervisory teams. So perhaps I could just do another round before we get started and just tell us, not necessarily the names of your supervisors, though I know you have had positive experiences with them from what you've already told me, but just tell me a little bit about who your supervisory team consists of. Who wants to go first? We can go in the same order or switch around.
I'll go first. Yeah, so I think I have quite a conventional supervision team. I've got two supervisors, both in the same department in anthropology in Aberdeen. And they were both people I had worked with before as part of my undergrad and master's, and that's how we kind of all knew each other. So I think it was quite a kind of conventional setup for me.
Great, thank you.
So I'm actually a collaborative doctoral award, which means I have an industry partner with my PhD. So I have 3 supervisors, 2 from the University of Aberdeen. They are in different disciplines and different departments, and 1 industry partner from the theatre organisation Imaginate, which supports the PhD.
Great, thank you. Who wants to go next? Stavrula.
Yeah, so my situation was very similar to Kirsty's. Both of my supervisors were at the same department, history, classics, and archaeology. So it wasn't something, you know.
Yeah, and were they people that you knew before?
No, because I did my bachelor and my master's in Greece. So I came to Scotland only for my PhD. My first supervisor is a little bit more experienced than my second, and a little bit older, you know. But they were both fantastic. It was like an excellent choice. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And Maya?
Yeah, I had a bit of a journey with my supervision team. I'll try to make it brief. I started with 3 supervisors, all in the same institution. My primary supervisor was the most experienced one, who was an expert in my field. My second supervisor was an expert in some of the theory I was using, and my third supervisor was an expert in some of the methods I was using, so internet research. Unfortunately, my second supervisor had to leave the supervision team because she had to go on sick leave. And that was about a year into the PhD. So then I was left with just the 2 supervisors. Then a year and a half into the PhD, my first supervisor moved institutions. So I had to decide whether to stay in the institution or move with her. And I decided to move with her. But I still kept my third supervisor, who was now my second supervisor. I'm sorry for the confusion. So at the end of my PhD, I had 2 supervisors based at 2 different institutions.
Okay, that does sound complicated.
Yes. I tried to make it as simple as
No. I think more complicated as something for you as a PhD researcher to live through and to handle, because you know these circumstances happen, don't they? You know, if someone's on sick leave, but that has an impact obviously on your PhD, and if your main supervisor moves institution, it throws lots of kind of additional questions up for you as well.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Could you actually, seeing as we're kind of here and talking about that, were there ways in which your supervisory team and you handled that to make that as smooth as possible, because they're not easy decisions to make and that's not an easy transition to go through? Yeah,
my primary supervisor was very good at kind of reassuring me of stability. Mm-hmm. So when my secondary supervisor had to leave, my first supervisor kind of stepped in. She was also very knowledgeable about the theory that my second supervisor contributed with. At this point, I had finished my literature review. So her essential contribution, she'd already kind of helped me with. Then when my primary supervisor moved institutions, I obviously panicked to begin with, because my first thought was, oh no, does this mean I will lose her as a supervisor? But she was very good at just kind of ensuring me that no matter what I decided to do, she would stay on as a supervisor, and that everything was kind of up to me. I could choose to stay at my institution, or I could choose to go with her, and regardless, she would be my supervisor and support me. And I think that was really essential in that moment, that where everything just felt very unstable and unsure. But just the fact that she kind of reassured me of that was, I think, really important to me at that time.
That's great. Yeah, great. Thank you. Fantastic. Okay, so I want to take you back to the beginnings of your PhD process, and for some of you that might even take you before you had that kind of formal first supervision, because obviously in developing a proposal you develop a strong relationship with people already, and Kirsty, you knew your supervisors very well already from your undergraduate and your master's. But I wondered if you could just each talk a bit, and I know for some of you it's longer ago than others, think about that kind of beginning of setting up the PhD process. What worked well in those initial meetings? What might you have liked to have known? What was perhaps too much to receive in the first couple of months? Were there kind of good things or things you would have liked in that kind of very first phase of your PhD? If I can cast your minds back to then. Who would like to say something about that?
I can start.
Go. Yes, please do, Stavros.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
So I do remember my first meeting very well. So even though it was like almost 4 years ago, with my primary supervisor, and it was like, I think it was very good because like as soon as we meet, like it's the first time we actually meet, and he was very positive, very encouraging, and also knowledgeable. And he gave me some directions for my PhD, and I was trying to follow them throughout all these 4 years. And what he did that was very helpful, even though a little bit stressful for me, he asked me to start writing almost immediately. So he told me, I want you to send me something like by the end of October. And we met like in the middle of September. So that was actually very helpful because it got me like started thinking, reading, writing, making notes. Obviously it was very early, so the things that I wrote weren't, the best things that I've ever written, but it was actually very helpful because I started writing from the beginning.
I would agree. Actually, it was one of the first things my supervisors did was to actually get me writing, because that was the biggest sort of fear I think I had, because I'd come from industry rather than an academic background. So it was a step change to what I was used to doing. So they did initially prompt me and encourage me to write something, and kind of that it didn't matter what it was, but it was just the process of writing it that was important. And in terms of my first meeting, my industry partner, who I knew prior to the supervision, because obviously I worked in the industry, which was quite small, was based in Edinburgh. I lived in Glasgow and my university was Aberdeen. So it was very, very rare to actually have, I don't think we've actually all been physically present in a supervision even prior to COVID. But what the industry partner did was really embrace the PhD as part of the organization. So I would spend a day in their office, and then I would do the supervision when I was physically with that supervisor. So I was never on my own when I did a supervision remotely. I always had a supervisor present. And they were just very, at the beginning, they were very generous and created an environment where I could ask all those questions that I thought were stupid about what I didn't know to do, and what the role was and things like that. So it just created an environment where I could ask questions without sort of worried about what they thought.
That's great. Did they do that in a particular way? I mean, how did you know that that was a safe environment to ask the questions that you thought were stupid, which I'm sure weren't stupid at all?
Well, no, but you were
process.
They're very calm, I suppose. It didn't feel that they were very, very conscious about saying that the supervisions were for me. So that they weren't for them, they were for me. It was for everything for me to get out what I needed from the supervision. So in that way, I felt when I went into a supervision, it was up to me to make the most of that time in terms of asking questions. And I would always try and work out what I needed to know before I went in and make the most of the time of having them in the room. So they were very clear that the supervision was for me. Also that they're very, all three of them are not light, but they don't make it very rigorous, or I don't know, the atmosphere is such that you feel you can ask anything and have a discussion. So I don't know if that's personalities or if that's something they set out to do. I also think there's something about having an industry partner who doesn't necessarily know the academic protocol in as much depth as the other two supervisors, so they can also chip in with questions that open things up for you that you might not have thought of.
Yeah, and I guess that must be an interesting relationship as well, because you already had that relationship with the industry partner, didn't you? So that was probably a stronger relationship that you had with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
The supervisors had with them. Yeah.
I mean, prior to the PhD, I was a producer of children's theatre, so I'd taken work to their festival and knew them in that context. So yeah.
Yeah, great, excellent.
Can I pick up on some of this, just to sort of second what Belinda and Stavrola said about so the sort of getting started with writing right away, because I think I feel like my primary supervisor talked about this already in the first meeting, which gave me a huge anxiety, because I've also been away from academia for I think 4 or 5 years before I started my PhD, and she suggested that. So I started my PhD in October, and she suggested that I would hand in my first piece of writing in December. And this was, I mean, I started with sort of putting together my literature review. So obviously I had to go back and do a lot of reading, and just the idea that she thought I would be able to actually produce any writing about any of this complicated theoretical material just seemed absolutely ridiculous to me. But she was quite insistent on this. And I think that was a really, really good idea, to try to convince me to get writing right away. Especially because when I've talked to some of my PhD friends and colleagues who didn't quite have that kind of setup, when they have maybe spent the first year or so not necessarily actually writing on their PhD, and then once they had to sit down and start writing, that just seemed like a completely impossible task. But I think, for me anyway, it was a really good idea to just start writing right away, so that the writing process became less kind of anxiety induced, I suppose.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. They had to kind of push you a bit to do the writing, and that can feel something that makes you quite anxious, but then you get over that more quickly.
Yeah, I think it was a necessary thing to be quite sort of insistent on that in the beginning, because like in the long run, clearly I can see now that that was the best way to do it. And if I can just add one thing to the sort of remembering back to the first meeting thing, because I think, as far as I remember, my primary supervisor kind of asked sort of, what do you expect of us as a supervisory team? Like, what is the best way for us to kind of help you? And that could be a bit of a difficult question, because you don't necessarily know yourself as a PhD student yet in the first meeting. But what I did know was that I'm the type of person who tends to procrastinate quite a bit, and who tends to finish assignments right up to a deadline. So I kind of explained that to them, and they suggested that I would then get quite sort of fixed deadlines for writing, and sort of more frequent deadlines. So rather than them saying, go away and write a chapter and we'll see you in a few months, then in the beginning especially, it was maybe 2 weeks between meetings, and I would always produce a tiny bit of writing, because then I would have quite regular fixed deadlines, and that kept me going. It was easier for me to work that way, and I kind of already knew that about myself going into the supervision and into the PhD. So I think it was useful for us to kind of set up those ground rules in the beginning, sort of what do I expect of them and what do they expect of me.
Yeah, and that kind of interesting as well to have that candid but kind of supportive conversation about what your modes are as a person, and what your behaviors are to be, and to support you in that way. Yeah. That's good. Thank you, Maya.
I think for me, I didn't do any writing in the first year of my PhD, and I think part of that is a disciplinary thing, because anthropologists tend not to want to write until they finished fieldwork, as a sort of general matter of principle. And also because on my master's, I'd kind of done a big proposal document instead of a master's thesis. So there was I didn't go in to do any writing in my first year. And I think in some ways that did set me up for a bit of a panic when I finally did have to sit down and write. And I think I don't know that I would have done it differently, but I can see why writing earlier might have made that kind of coming back from fieldwork and suddenly realizing I had to start writing was a bit complicated. The one thing that we did set up very early on is that I was expected to write up a kind of brief summary, not massive, kind of 250 words after every supervision meeting, so that we could go over what we had talked about. And then I kept all of those documents saved, so we have a record of what we discussed at every supervision meeting over the whole course of my PhD. And that was quite useful, because it was easy then to keep track of kind of what we talked about, whether we were meeting goals, whether I had forgotten to do something or whatever. And it also then made filling in, when the university required its own kind of assessments every 6 months, we had the stuff all there ready to go. So that was quite a useful thing to set up right from the start.
Yeah. Yep, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that we did that as well, and it is really useful, because it's also those conversations that you organically have in a supervision that you can actually forget what you've had in terms of when it shifts your work as well, and then just have that record to go back to. And what we also I'm deadline driven. That's what I like to call procrastinating. But
that's better. I like that.
I'm deadline driven. So we always have the deadlines as well. But it always, for me, we ended every supervision with a focus and an action for me to take away from it. So I never left kind of thinking, right now I'm just going back to nothing. It's like, right now I know what my next step is and what I need to do and what I need to research and write about, which was important.
I was actually doing something very similar to what Kirsty was doing. So every time before I went to a meeting, I had a list with like bullet points, so things that we had to discuss about, you know, the PhD itself, but also maybe a conference presentation or a scholarship application, whatever. So every time we had a list of the things that we had discussed, and that was actually very helpful. And I have kept all of these.
And did you send those to your supervisors in advance, or did you just go through them at the top of the meeting?
At the meeting itself. So I would print 2 copies of them, and I would keep one, and I would give one to my supervisor.
Yeah. Do the rest of you did something similar, or do something similar to that? So have an agenda for the meeting.
Yeah, I always do. I have things I have to answer. I don't actually give it to them. I just say it in the meeting first. But yeah, no, I always list the things that I need to know, because you can just, if you get involved in a conversation, you can forget. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Things that I need to know by the end, and also that I can come back to by the end of the meeting. Go, okay, I know I've touched on everything that I needed to.
Yeah, I did the same. So I would always have sort of a document on my laptop. Well, at the end of sort of my PhD, because in the beginning I did notes in my notebook, and I realized later that I should just have brought in my laptop. So I did that eventually. So I would go into a meeting, have a document open, and then sort of the last few days or week leading up to the supervision, I would start writing things down to remember what I needed to discuss in the meeting. So I would have that document open where I would also write notes from the meeting. So it was all kind of in the same document for me.
Yeah.
And I also did sort of like action points with my supervisors in the meeting as well, so that it was also quite clear to me what I needed to do, like next, what's the next thing I'm going to work on. And we would always set up the next meeting as well. So at the end of every supervision meeting, I knew when my next supervision meeting was going to be, and exactly when my next deadline was going to be for whatever piece of writing I was working on. So that was really clear, and made it quite easy for me to sort of leave that supervision meeting where we had often discussed a lot of things, and then go back and be like, okay, I actually know what I need to do now.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, just picking up on what Maya was saying, I found that at the very start of my PhD, maybe for the first year, we were really, really good at the end of the supervision meeting going, okay, well, the next one's going to be in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever. This dropped off a little bit kind of as the PhD got towards the middle. And it wasn't just my supervisors, it was the 3 of us, kind of got a bit complacent. And I found that actually, even if we were leaving bigger gaps between the meetings, which became appropriate to do as we got further through the PhD, it would still have been helpful to have a date set for the next one, even if it was 6 or 8 weeks away. So that's something I think going back I would have done differently, is always make sure there was another meeting set, even if it was a while away.
That's a really interesting point, actually, because I think all of us can set out with really good intentions as to how to do things and document and record and have the action points. But I wonder if there is something in the sort of midpoint of your PhD where you're getting on with it, but perhaps some of the systems, the good systems that you set up, maybe fall away a little bit. I don't know if those of you, Stavrula and Maya, whether that was also the case for you, or whether you managed to keep up that momentum throughout.
Yeah,
I think I kind of managed to keep up the momentum, and I think our supervisions got better eventually as we got to know each other better as well. So my supervisors got to know me better and understood what kind of feedback I needed and worked, like how I worked. And also I think we just set up the way the meetings were going to be, and we just kept going that way. I guess it's because I knew that I needed deadlines. So I knew that I also needed to make sure I had a deadline when I left the meeting, and I had a new meeting when I left the meeting. I had the date for the next meeting. So I think I knew that this was what worked for me, and I wanted to keep doing that, I guess.
So you were pretty insistent on, we're going to continue.
I suppose I was probably insistent as well, yeah.
Good. Great. Stavrula, you were going to...
Yeah, the same thing. So we didn't have like regular meetings in a way, like we wouldn't say we will meet again in 3 or 4 weeks. It wasn't like set up beforehand, because both of like me and my 2 supervisors were traveling a lot. So I spent a lot of time, like 2 months in Italy, 1 month in Germany, maybe 2 months in Switzerland. So a lot of traveling. So we would arrange the meetings, not beforehand, but they were always, you know, we were always very satisfied, and there was good communication, so either in person or by email. So I would always receive the same level of supervision from the beginning until the very end, even after the pandemic.
Great. So a potential number of different models, actually, depending on the supervisory team and the supervisee as well. Is there anything else thinking about kind of structuring those supervision meetings that you found particularly useful, or you would have liked, or, you know, you heard some of your PhD colleagues talking about and you thought that would have been a really good thing to do?
I think it's worth thinking about right at the start the combinations that you're meeting in, especially if there's like kind of multiple people on the team. Like, is it always going to be you and both of your supervisors at the same time, or is there a space to be having meetings with just two of you? Because one of the things that I found is my supervisors are really good friends with each other, right? And so we tended to meet as a three because we all kind of get on really well. But especially at the beginning for me as a kind of new PhD student, I found kind of being in this room with these two academics who were good friends, who were then bouncing things off each other, quite intimidating. And it might have been helpful to have a couple of meetings with just one or the other as well as the joint one. And that's kind of happened more as the PhD has gone through and different commitments have got in the way. And so we've kind of had a few smaller meetings, but it might be worth thinking about how you're going to do that, and whether it might be useful to try different combinations, because obviously dynamics are always going to be different with smaller groups and bigger groups.
Yeah, that's
I mean, I never had, oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I never had specific supervisory meetings where it wasn't the three of them, but because I spent a day in my industry partner's office, I was like in that environment and being able to have conversations that weren't supervisory nature and stuff, but checking in on things and embedding with other staff there. And I also audited a couple of anthropology courses, and I would meet my supervisor beforehand and be able just to chat about the course and academic conversations and be able to think about things that were bothering me without the sort of official supervisory capacity. So there was room to have more informal chats with supervisors throughout it, as opposed to in a supervisory meeting on a one-to-one.
Yeah. Great. One of the bullet points I had that I sent around to you was managing your supervisor, exclamation mark. I mean, this is really, as you know, this session is really to be viewed by the supervisors rather than other PhD researchers, but have any of you got anything that you might want to say about, you know, having that kind of quite difficult relationship of thinking, you know, here's someone who is in career terms, obviously quite a way down the line from you, but you actually making sure that your supervision is something that you want it to be? Have any of you got any thoughts or comments around that?
I have sort of something like that, which kind of picks up on what Kirsty was just talking about, by being overwhelmed by multiple supervisors. Because in the meetings where all three of my supervisors were there, I often found myself completely overwhelmed, and I found that they were giving me contradictory advice, and I wasn't really sure how to handle that. And I think especially so that would be in the beginning of my PhD, where I was mostly working on my lit review, and two of my supervisors could give me sort of expert advice on the theory I was using. And then my third supervisor was not an expert on the theory, but would still give me advice. And I found that it was not helpful to have her in the meetings when we were discussing sort of, at this stage in the PhD, where we were discussing the theory. And I struggled with finding a way to kind of articulate this. And I think it's somewhere in between realizing that she's, you know, a sort of an academic, an accomplished academic in a different stage than I am in. So I don't want to seem unappreciative of her help, and I also don't want to hurt her feelings, I suppose. So I had a conversation with my primary supervisor, just the two of us, where I said, I don't think it's helpful to have her in these meetings right now because I feel overwhelmed, and I feel like the two of you are sort of the experts that I need in this stage. So I think it ended with I think my primary supervisor basically was then the one to kind of communicate this to the third supervisor after I had kind of raised the issue with my primary supervisor. And then we sort of agreed that, okay, from this stage, my primary supervisor will always be in the meetings, but depending on what we discuss, we will then sort of include whichever of the other two supervisors who will be most beneficial for whatever stage I'm in with the PhD. So that was a really difficult conversation for me to have, but I mean, obviously it was necessary, and it was then better afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you, Maya. Because I think that can be, it can be a really rich relationship having all of those people in the room, but I can certainly see that it can be overwhelming, and if you feel like they're talking to each other rather than necessarily to you, or which direction to take things in. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else have any comments about managing your supervisors?
I guess I think it's just in terms of the roles of the supervisor. So, I mean, I've had contradictory comments in terms of writing that I've done because they come from different departments and they see things in different ways, and that's kind of, but not actually in my supervision. But for me, it was understanding which supervisor would be the one that would sort out the bureaucracy bits, and which supervisor was more comfortable with the academic bits, and then knowing who you kind of need to go to with which bit to get that sorted. You see what I mean? So that was just working out who's more comfortable doing what in terms of that was very helpful.
Yeah, and did you do that explicitly? Did you have a conversation with them about that, or did you just?
No, I just went, oh. So I didn't have an explicit conversation, but yeah, no, I didn't have an explicit conversation. I would just then speak direct in the supervisor in front of everyone, but be a bit more explicit in terms of directing it to the supervisor that I knew would be like, I'll sort that. I can't do it. It's just understanding the different roles they play, I guess, within the team. Yeah,
great. I wanted to pick up on, you were talking, Maya, about receiving contradictory feedback from 2 or 3 different supervisors. So there's kind of that issue, and you kind of talked through how you dealt with it there. But more generally, could you say a bit about receiving feedback from your supervisor, and if there were things that you thought that your supervisors did particularly well in terms of letting you have feedback? You also talked about starting writing really early, and obviously that can feel quite stress-inducing, but are there things that your supervisors did which really helped you in terms of giving you feedback on your writing or your ideas, or both, or things that you wish they had done?
Can I pick up on this again?
Yes, please.
I got excellent feedback from my supervisors. I want to make that absolutely clear. The thing with the excellent feedback that I got from my supervisors was that it was often my supervisors made sure that my thesis at the end was as good as it could possibly be. So they would pick up on everything they thought wasn't good enough. This kind of feedback could feel quite critical. And the thing with doing a PhD, for me anyway, was that it became part of who I was as a person. So criticism of my thesis was a criticism of me as a person, or that's how it felt. So I would probably have liked to have seen some more positive feedback on my thesis as well, because I could sometimes, when I read through feedback on a chapter and just saw all the sort of red remarks and the general sort of senses of this needs to be better, I could have used a bit of, this is actually really good what you've done so far, and this bit is good, or this bit is good. So a bit more of a mix of the positive and quite critical remarks, I think would have been useful for me. Yeah. Especially because when you're doing a PhD, you tend to doubt yourself so much, and you don't really know if you're doing well or not. And sometimes you can really need to hear like, you are actually doing really well. You just need to fix a few things.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because I know sometimes when I'm going through drafts of my PhD researcher's work, you know, I'll have 3 pages where I've said nothing, and that's because I deem that nothing needs to be improved. But I should say that. I should say this was, you know, these were 3 really good pages, you know, this sentence was excellent, whatever it is. But I think too often, certainly I feel like I just don't say anything on those bits because I think they don't need fixing.
Yeah. No, I agree with that, because like also the feedback I received was really good, outstanding. It was quite critical, but there were also moments where you would read on the document like very good points. So that was good, because you would think, okay, there's one good point here. So it's good for your confidence, actually. So I agree with Maya.
Yeah, I think one of the things I noticed is my supervisors have a bit of a tendency to say nothing if everything is fine, and only to say something when they're criticizing something, and that's fine. But it took me a while to work out that that's what was happening, and then kind of adjust it in my head so that I knew that actually everything was okay. Because it wasn't just for criticism on written work, but also on my actual process of my research. So I would come into my supervision meetings and say, oh, I've done this and this, and I've been to this archive and I've done these things, and they'd just be like, okay, and move on. And I think I was sitting there going, was that right? Was I supposed? And I think there is a tendency for supervisors, when they have students who they think, okay, well, this student is competent, they're clearly doing their research well, to not say that. And I think that that's something that it might be nice just to have that said every once in a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very fair points, I think. I was interested as well with what you said, Maya, about trying to fix everything, or kind of being very critical, because, you know, there's so many different ways in which you can give feedback. So you can give feedback about the ideas, you can give feedback about the way in which it's expressed, you can give feedback on a line-by-line basis about the language, you can, you know, talk about and I wonder sometimes if it does feel like a bit of a barrage of stuff all at once. And I don't know if any of you have experience of your supervisor just focusing on 1 or 2 particular areas rather than trying to sort everything simultaneously, if that's a helpful mode.
One thing that I think works really well with the way that my supervisors give feedback is that I have one supervisor who is a line by line, absolutely picking up on everything person, and the other one does a lot more of like a general feedback and kind of general comments and just picking up on a couple of things. And I don't think they planned this. I think this is just the way that they both tend to mark, but it works really well to have one doing one style of marking or feedback and one doing another. And it also means that if I'm feeling wobbly, I can pick the one who's generally nicer to read first. So I think that works really well.
Yeah. And in terms of how you've received feedback, in terms of timing, have you received it in the meeting, before the meeting, so you've had time to process it? What's the kind of, you know, is it on a piece of paper? Obviously not at the moment, but, you know, what have you done, and what's worked well, or what do you think is a better mode of receiving feedback?
So may I start? I would always receive the feedback before the meeting, so I had plenty of time to read it and process it, and, you know, maybe ask the questions, prepare the questions that I had. So I think that was very helpful, at least for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's a right or wrong, you know, way of different people will react in different ways, but I don't know with the rest of you if you have a sense of what kind of has worked well, or what you prefer as a style.
I always received feedback in advance as well. I think maybe a day in advance, so I would have time to sort of read through it, so that if I had questions about it, then I could ask in the meeting. I think that's the best way to do it. I would also add that I think the best way to give feedback is to do it, you know, what's the word I'm looking for, in a Word document, and not print out the document and give handwritten notes, because I've experienced that as well, and that's just, don't do that. We can't read your notes.
See, I actually kind of loved when my supervisor used to give me handwritten notes, but they are kind of useless, because when you have to then go back to them in 6 months' time, they're not handily saved in a folder with all your other feedback. They're like shoved in like under your desk somewhere. But I think feedback in advance, like for 24, 48 hours in advance of the supervision meeting is really, really helpful, because it also gives you a little bit of time to process it. I think one of the lower moments of my PhD was I just submitted my first ever full chapter, and my line-by-line supervisor had come back with this incredible barrage of really helpful but really critical comments, and she sent the email, and I got it and I read them, and I was quite upset, because like it was the first chapter and this was a lot of feedback, and she walked round right past my office and she caught me in like full like tears of like stress. And so I feel like maybe giving your supervisees some space after you send them critical feedback is probably quite helpful.
It's good advice, yeah.
Yeah, usually I would get like 3, 4, or 5 days before the meeting, so a lot of time to process things and think and deal with the emotions that you may have.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Belinda? Say again, Belinda, sorry.
I've always received it in advance of the meeting. I think it would just be too intense to get it like during the meeting. And because somebody's always been remotely, my feedback has always been in Word documents with the notes on it. And it's so useful having it like that. I don't think if it was handwritten, I'm just like, oh my goodness. Because you just refer back to it loads of times when you're working on other stuff later and things. So, yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thinking, Kirsty, you were talking about that difficult moment that you had with receiving the chapter, that particular chapter with all the feedback on it. Are there particular, without necessarily asking you to talk about kind of specific kind of personal or intellectual challenges that you had, and unless you're happy and prepared to do that, but are there particular ways in which everybody finds doing their PhD at some point or another challenging in some way or another? Are there ways in which your supervisor made that copable with, or was particularly helpful for you to deal with that?
Yeah, so I think I have 2 supervisors, and one of my supervisors is really good at talking about kind of like feelings and emotions and the way they might be fitting into the PhD, and the other one is less good at that. It is much more kind of fixed on, okay, well, this is what we're doing, and this is the process, and this is like, treat it like a job and don't take your emotions into it too much. And I think that balance is fine, but it's helpful to have at least one person on a supervision team who is willing to kind of come in and ask the question, like, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And that's a question I think it's probably quite important to include in supervision meetings, even if it's not like a full meeting when everyone's there, but in some context within the supervision, because there have been times when, like, I had a very big breakup right towards the start of my PhD, and that had a really significant effect, and it was really, really useful having one supervisor who was able to go, okay, how are you feeling? How is this going to impact your work, and what can we do about it? And I think any supervision team needs to have someone who can ask those questions on it.
Yeah, great.
I mean, there's been huge challenges with my PhD due to the coronavirus, which have been absolutely massive. And my pilot research week was the week before lockdown, and I had to leave the school after half a day because it couldn't happen, etc., etc. But my industry, so my physical fieldwork is connected to the work of my industry partner, and they were amazing in terms of the pandemic, is treating me as a member of staff, so inviting me for coffee mornings every week, for staff meeting catch-ups, and a lot of that was really, really helpful with the isolation that suddenly appears because you can't go anywhere and you can't do anything. So that was like another structure that you could have to then, like, okay, so we have 9:30 catch-up in the morning, and then I can get on with my day, and that's me started and doing it. And my academic supervisors were really good for checking in, but obviously they've also got the impact of the work on them and what they're doing at home and their family life and caring for their children, etc. Whereas because Imagine it was an organization with staff that had to keep going, they just kind of absorbed me into those staff meetings, and so then it was part of the structure. So that was a really good way of maintaining contact and keeping focus during that. And my academic supervisors completely checked in as well, but it was just being able to check in on like 2 or 3 times a week was just really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that transition to remote supervision, I guess, has kind of affected everybody. So, but Maya, you had your Viva in March, so I guess you'd we'll talk about Viva preparation in a second, but for everyone else, are there other things that have kind of worked for you in terms of COVID, remote supervision that have been?
I didn't have any big challenges because I was lucky enough to submit my thesis at the beginning of April. But what I found really, really helpful was that I kept talking to my supervisors via Skype or Zoom, and they were always very helpful, and they were always very willing to chat. So even after the submission, we had meetings, you know, for the Viva, or maybe, you know, advising me on academic jobs or applications, you know, whatever. And what I found really, really useful was that they were always there, you know, always willing to chat, even over Skype and Zoom. So that was very good for my, you know, psychology.
Yeah. I mean, Belinda, you were obviously used to doing remote supervisions anyway, but as you said, always with one of the supervisors in the room and the other two. So
I think it was less of a shift in terms of supervision because we'd always had that remote experience anyway. So I didn't feel like the supervisions changed in terms of quality or people being supportive or anything like that. And I was really used to working in that way. So that wasn't as much of a transition as it might have been for people who'd always had physical supervisions to go to that. So working a remote supervision, I mean, it's fine. It's obviously, I guess I'm just used to it. You just have to be more, I think you need more planning before you go into it because it's such a different environment and you're managing other things. So it's just that. But yeah, the transition to remote supervision was very simple for me.
Mm-hmm. And if your supervisors were inclined to give you paper drafts with scroll on it, they definitely can't do that anymore.
They can't do that now, God, no. that is the silver lining that you have to find for it.
No more impossible to read supervisor handwriting. Great, maybe let's have a think, and this is probably more Stavrula and Maya in particular, about kind of in the run-up to submission, perhaps as one point, and then the Viva itself. So just talk us through what your supervisors did to get you to that submission point. How did they help you out with that? What worked well for you?
So I submitted a first full draft of my thesis a few months in advance of submission, and then received, you know, feedback on the whole thesis. And then we had an extra long supervision meeting. I think we had a 3-hour-long supervision meeting because that gave us a chance to basically talk about the thesis as a whole. And this was obviously the first time that my supervisors had sort of seen the whole thesis. So it was both kind of, in that meeting, it was both feedback on sort of, I mean, most of the chapters they'd already seen some version of. So it was both kind of quite specific feedback on what works well in which chapter, but also sort of does the argument work as a whole. So then they gave me obviously a lot of feedback, and then I went back and basically incorporated all their feedback and worked towards the final draft a few months later. I think I didn't have another meeting after that. I think I was just sort of, what's the right way of saying? I basically went and just sort of worked on it on my own based on those comments and then submitted.
Okay.
And I know for a lot of my friends and colleagues, they have had quite a different experience with those last few months.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, it worked for me.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, obviously it did.
I think my experience was slightly different because my supervisors didn't read the final draft. So we were working on chapters, so chapter by chapter. And so I first wrote like a first draft of chapter 1, then a second draft of chapter 1. So I was improving the chapters based on their comments. And at the end, like they said, this is pretty good, we're satisfied, so you can bring everything together and submit. And that took maybe 3 or 4 months for me, just to, you know, read everything, make sure that there are no mistakes and everything. But I think like the best thing that a supervisor can do is just to be there for the student, and support him or her psychologically, but also with providing feedback and being there. I think that's the most important.
Great. Yeah. And how about
my supervisor, especially my primary supervisor, during those last months would check in and just say, if there's anything at all you're not sure about, please, you know, contact me.
Yeah, so it wasn't that they left you to your own devices.
I wasn't left completely on my own. It's
No.
just didn't have a fixed sort of supervision meeting after that big one.
Yeah, great. And how about preparation for the Viva? Were there particular things that your supervisors did, or you know that some of your colleagues did, that worked well?
So I had a mock Viva in the week of my Viva. My Viva was on a Friday and I had a mock Viva on a Monday. And that was so useful for me. And sort of before the mock Viva, so that was just with my primary supervisor. And she asked if I'd rather, how was it? Well, she basically asked, would you rather that I be as tough on you as possible so that you're prepared for anything and that your Viva will seem less scary once you're in the situation? Or would you rather have a mock Viva that's a bit more kind of supportive to build up confidence? And I kind of went with the first option. So she was quite tough on me, but it didn't feel overwhelming. So I thought I felt like my mock Viva was harder than my Viva, but it wasn't in a way where I felt like I left the room with no confidence at all. So it wasn't, I mean, she wasn't that hard on me after all. It was just she asked some difficult questions and some very specific questions about the Viva, which made me think about those things and make sure that I would have answers for any kind of possible situation. But more than that, she also sort of, and she didn't tell me until afterwards what she did. So she did sometimes sort of interrupt me a little bit when I was trying to say something, and kind of just do a lot of sort of different things that I suppose that she's seen actual examiners do in Vivas, just to kind of prepare me for anything really. But for me, that worked really well. And then, so, I mean, obviously I had a bit of a special situation because leading up to my Viva, I didn't know if it was going to happen in person or over Zoom, because the lockdown happened 3 days after my Viva.
Okay.
So technically, I mean, it was all those weeks back in March where everything was so uncertain. But my supervisor, I thought, did a really good job of just sort of checking in, sending emails whenever she had any information. So the first thing that happened was that it became obvious that my external examiner was not going to be able to be physically at the Viva because she had to fly in from another country. And then basically we discussed back and forth, should I have my Viva over Zoom or should I postpone? And my supervisor advised that I had it over Zoom because who knew when, you know, no one knew anything back then. But I think she did a really good job of just sort of reassuring me that this was what was going to happen. She also suggested that we could have the mock Viva over Zoom to kind of prepare.
Yeah, because we're all so used to it now, aren't we? But back in March.
Back then we didn't. I mean, I used Zoom for the first time, I think a week before my Viva. So yeah, all of that just felt really, it made me much more nervous for my Viva than I would have been otherwise because of, you know, external circumstances. But I think the main thing my supervisor did was just to sort of take charge and be on top of things and communicate really clearly to me what my options were and what she thought also was the best advice she could give me for that situation. So I think that was really central to making that experience as good as possible.
Great, that's great. How about you, Stavroula? You were obviously a little bit later on.
Yeah, so I knew that it would be over Zoom, or it was actually with Microsoft Teams. And that was actually an application that I never used. So that was really a little bit scary. I didn't have a mock Viva. I mean, I discussed it with my supervisors, but they didn't think it was necessary. What I did before my Viva was like maybe 3 weeks before it, I tried to read over the thesis twice or 3 times and, you know, make notes and things like that. And I had Skype meetings with my supervisors, but separately. And so they gave me advice of, you know, what the questions usually are. So how the situation will be when you're there, like over Skype and things like that. So that was very helpful. They gave me a lot of feedback, and because they also have a lot of experience as examiners. And that was very, very helpful for me. And the Viva wasn't that hard after all. So the Viva wasn't stressful. The examiners were very cool and relaxed.
Great. It sounds like you all have really good supervisors, which is...
I had.
That's great to hear.
One of the things that my supervisors have been doing for me now that I'm kind of drafting full chapters, I've done quite a few now, is that when they give me feedback on the chapters, they put comments in the margins that say specifically, if you were in a Viva, I would ask you this, can you think of, and they're starting to do that now, to try and we do that in supervision meetings too, just to, and I think the idea is to sort of gently ease me into starting to think about how I would respond to a Viva. So that's something I find really useful, because in some ways it's making the Viva prospect seem less scary if I've spent like the better part of a year starting to think in those terms anyway. So I think that's been really helpful.
Yeah, that's I don't think I do that, so I might well take that that tip away. Thank you. And also as well, because you have this, you know, close working relationship with your supervisors, and obviously they know your work so well that actually kind of trying to get you into the headspace of, you know, someone who is going to get your work, to know your work so well, like not many other people will do, you know, until it becomes a monograph or articles or whatever it might be. But, you know, being able to talk about your work in that way for that different audience, I think. Yeah, good, excellent. Just before we wrap up, I just wondered if anyone else had anything else that they would like to say, any additional tips for supervisors, whether they're kind of very experienced supervisors or doing it for the first time, things that you really like that your supervisors did, or that, you know, colleagues, supervisors did. Is there anything else that you'd like to pass on? Things to do, things not to do?
Yeah, I can say things not to do.
Okay,
I think my supervisors haven't done that, but I have heard from other colleagues. So I think it's not good for a supervisor not to respond to emails. Like for me, that was very helpful. I knew that every time I would send an email, I would receive an answer even within minutes. And that was very good, because I would feel that I had the support, and know that other people, you know, have been sending emails and waiting for weeks and weeks and weeks. And that can be very, very stressful, because, you know, writing a PhD is not easy. So it's always, I think, very important for supervisors to be there and respond as promptly as possible.
great.
I just want to second that, because I've heard some horror stories from colleagues where supervisors haven't replied in weeks and months, and they just don't hear anything from them, and they're kind of on their own. Then I'd also like to add, actually, that, I mean, I know I talked before about how positive feedback can be really useful as well as critical feedback. But I also have some colleagues who mostly receive just really sort of positive feedback, and it just leaves them wondering, will my thesis actually be good enough to pass the Viva in the end if they don't seem to be critical of my writing? So I think it's complicated, but I think there's a fine line there where surely things can always be improved a little bit with the thesis. And I don't know if it just comes down to sort of time constraints, but I think it's just really important for supervisors to be thorough in their feedback and actually give useful feedback to students, even if they are doing well or whatever the reason is.
Great, thank you.
One of the things that I would say I think is really useful is not necessarily for supervisors to be prescriptive, but especially at the start to be specific and about what they expect, and not to make assumptions about what your student knows or doesn't know about the way that a PhD should work or the way academics works. Because at the start, even though I'd kind of been in the department for my undergrad and my master's, I didn't really know what a reasonable number of conferences to attend would be. I didn't know what reasonable expectations about writing book reviews or articles were. And I felt that my supervisors maybe made some assumptions that I knew more than I actually did, just because I'd been around the department a while and various things. And so it would, I think, have been helpful for me to sit down and for them to kind of outline maybe even what they kind of did in a year in terms of conferences and what they thought was reasonable and that kind of thing, which they did do once I asked them, but I didn't realize that I needed to ask that question until later than I would have liked. So it might be helpful to have that kind of worked in at the start of a relationship, I would have thought.
Yeah, great. Very helpful. Thank you. Belinda, do you have anything you want to add? Or?
No, I'd really just echo a lot of what's been said in terms of, I did have a pre-existing relationship with the industry organisation who are my partner, but I have heard of a lot of, not a lot because there's not many of us, but a few people who've struggled to make inroads into working with their industry partner because the organisation might be really big and they're not necessarily a strategic priority, or they've just found it really, really difficult to find inroads into that organisation. And so I would just be really hopeful that supervisors within organizations can open up the organization more to the PhD student rather than just their relationship with them, and also respond to emails, because there are people who are like months in who haven't been able to actually chat to their industry supervisors and stuff. So yeah, that would be my shout out.
Great. So great. I mean, I've certainly learned a lot from hearing the four of you talk. So thank you so much. I'm definitely getting that kind of being supportive, being responsive, a good mix of positive and critical, constructively critical feedback, and a lot of kind of, I suppose, being organized and quite structured about the relationships as well. But yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, all of you. And I'm going to pause the recording now.